right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to another of our exciting historian interview series. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Judith Giesberg. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for watching.
We're going to be talking about her very exciting book, Sex in the Civil War, which I have here, and you can also see above her above her shoulder there. If you're intrigued and enticed by our conversation today, you can get it in our bookshop, which you can come into the museum physically to do, or you can get it through our online store, and there'll be a link to that in the description of the video here. So there's many ways to get it, and that's a great way to support these videos. If you like the video, an easy free way to help us is to like it and share the video. But if you want to take your support a bit further, you can get a copy of the book through the museum, or you can become a member of the museum for as low as $25 a year. Your membership money supports what we do here, including getting to talk with leading scholars on various topics related to Civil War medicine, and I know this promises to be a really exciting one. So with all that said, I wondered if, Judy, you might tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the field of Civil War history in the first place.
Sure. So I went to graduate school actually thinking that I was going to be studying the American Revolution. But in my first year, I took a seminar on the Civil War, and became much more interested in what I was reading, the exciting work that was being done on Civil War, and in particular, a lot of the new scholarship that was coming out while I was in graduate school on gender. So Catherine Clinton and Nina Silver's Divided Houses, which is now a classic, just came out while I was in graduate school, and I read it and was very excited about the essays in it and just the potential to contribute to the effort to look at the Civil War for what it could teach us about gender. And so I was hooked on the Civil War. My interest in this topic and gender. So those two things came together for me. I'm not exactly sure where I would have gone had I not sort of discovered the gender in the Civil War, because for me the hook was to be able to sort of use gender as a tool and to think about this period in a different way. And then my interest in this topic that we're talking about today is a little bit more circuitous. So I'm not sure if you want to jump into that right away, or you want to think about it.
Sure. Yeah. No. I'm always curious how and this is why I like doing the interview things as interview style as opposed to a presentation, because you don't often get that insight into where the book came from and how an author even got to a point where they're in a position to write a book like this. So I love hearing that. Sometimes the best laid plans just totally go awry. But yes, how did Sex in the Civil War come to be?
Sure. So when I was studying, when I first began to sort of aspire to be a Civil War historian and reading everything I could, which at the time wasn't a lot, but it was definitely developing on gender in the Civil War, I came across a book that a lot of Civil War buffs are very familiar with, and people who are casually interested in sort of the 19th century probably came across, and that's Tom Lowry's book, What the Soldiers Didn't, I just forgot the title of it, but Tom Lowry's book, which was also Sex, which the secondary title was Sex in the Civil War, was something that I discovered in a bookshop, and sort of stowed that topic away and thought, okay, well, this is very interesting to sort of think about to potentially think about pornography as a way to understanding something about the way Civil War soldiers thought of themselves. And sort of put that away because to my mind, it didn't seem to be gender because there really weren't any women in it. It was, it was men looking at pictures and talking to other men about what they saw. And so it didn't come back to me again until I was teaching a lot of gender classes and a lot of women's history classes my first few years as a professor, and really started to think more critically about the post-war era and this period in which we think about, that this sort of correction that occurred culturally after the social disruptions of the war. And we can look at this sort of correction in a lot of ways. In some ways, it in the most obvious way, it manifests itself in a rejection of the social policies instituted and the constitutional change that occurred during Reconstruction. There was clearly a correction that we sort of think about as as the beginning of redemption, and then we sort of slide into Jim Crow and the reversal of all that civil rights progress. Another way we think about this social correction or this correction is in the ways in which of course, suffrage was rebooted and women's rights movements were restarted that had gone kind of static during the Civil War. But there also emerged a really strong counter movement against that, against suffrage. The sort of anti-suffrage campaign became emboldened at this moment as well. And people really began to talk about sort of what had sort of slipped out of its place during the war. And one of the things that people talked about was, was all the ways in which women had kind of grown to reach the moment, the crisis of the war, and that really that was that was a problem, right? And that something had been lost in the process. So there was this sort of ambitious effort to correct that as well. And for me, what interests me about pornography is how it became part of, the campaign against pornography really became part of this overcorrection of what had happened or what people believed had happened. It's sort of, that somehow women and men had lost the sense of who they were, and Americans' gender relations had gotten sort of had gone into disarray during the war, and this pornography campaign was part of it. So I came back to something that had interested me about Tom Lowry's path-breaking work all those years ago, and to think about what what pornography could tell us about what people after the war came to see as this sort of problem with gender relations. And so that's how this book came to be. And I discovered that although although this book was the first book that I wrote in which there weren't any women in it at all, right? They were all sort of paper women. The social consequences and the political consequences of this battle over pornography has had very, very long legs, and I would argue that sort of cultural moment of the post-war era and this battle over pornography, we still live with the ramifications of it today in the way we talk about gender and women's rights, and the way we think about those things, and the way those things are played out in our politics.
There's a lot of interesting things in there. One of which being, how the Civil War is this incredible moment where so much changes in the United States. And something that I think we don't think about very often is this kind of critical societal analysis that people do after the war is over, when people start thinking either consciously or unconsciously, this went from, one way, now it's another way. Is it good that it did that? And should we try and get it back to the way it was? And that's a really fascinating process that I think you highlighted there, and of course highlight in the book as well. That's really, really quite interesting, I think. Well, Sex in the Civil War has been out for a little while now, coming up on 5 years, I think, if my math is right. It came out in 2017. Now that it's been out for a little bit, it's I can say one of our best-selling books here at the museum. What has the reception been like since it's come out, both in the scholarly community or just in people, that have you gotten a lot of notes about the book, or what? I mean, take that wherever you want to go with it.
Sure. I've been really thrilled at the variety of responses that the book has, has elicited. So there's sort of different categories of people who I've come in contact with, who read the book and have different responses for it. I would say, the first sorts of groups of people who reached out in response to the book were first collectors who saw the book, and people will note that the book has images in it, but and when you read the book, you'll note that one of the things I talked about was the challenges of finding this stuff, because pornography was not collected in people's letters. People didn't send this stuff home with letters, letters that they wrote to their mothers or their wives. And so it didn't sort of naturally wind up in the places that Civil War historians usually look, which are archives that have letters from soldiers in them, and the stuff is just not there. So it was a challenge to find. They're talking about it, and certainly the officers and the sort of military discipline officials are concerned about it, and then very importantly, Congress does become very interested in this stuff. But the porn itself was sort of these ghosts in the machine, which I couldn't find. So when I wrote the book, I have to again mention Lowry here, because Tom was very generous, and he was a collector. He is still very much with us. I don't know that he collects anymore, but he has a collection himself of materials. But most of the stuff, it was very difficult to find because it was not collected by the Library of Congress and the National Archives or Carlisle military collections. They're just not there. But Lowry lent me his collection, and other private individuals allowed me to work with their materials. And then the Kinsey Library in Indiana was one place I could find some of the stuff that people were talking about. But so when the book first came out, the first sort of group of enthusiastic readers were the collectors who said, I have this, I know what you're talking about, and I have the image. So I started actually getting a lot of the porn sent to me after the book came out, which was lovely, right? Everybody wants to receive porn in their email inbox, right? Unfortunately, it was too late because the book was out. But and as a college professor, it's not necessarily something you want in your professional account. But everybody, but this obviously was something I was working on because of its scholarly interest. So those were some of the first enthusiastic responses that I got were collectors who were incredibly generous and just said, listen, I know you wrote about this stuff. I thought maybe you'd actually like to look at the image that you talk about there, or at least be able to sort of see what it is that these men were referencing. So that was very rewarding to get to sort of think about, not to sort of try to visualize it, but to actually see what some of the stuff that they were talking about. And then I would say the second, most enthusiastic early on responses I got were from active military or recently active military people who really responded to what the book talks about, which is, which for me was a very interesting thing to learn, was how pornography became part of sort of exchanges among, in this book, among men, right? That it became a kind of currency, that men from different parts of the country and sort of different classes and different backgrounds could, sort of understand. It was a common language and a common way of seeing one another. And it was very interesting to me to think about that in this context, and to hear from active and recently active military personnel who read the book and said, yeah, this rings really true. And for them to see this sort of, cluelessness of Congress when they, overcorrect and pass these laws that don't ever really work for what they're intended to do, but that just underscore their lack of understanding of what's going on in military camps. So those are the kinds of things that resonated with active duty military personnel, both women and men, who talked about the porn that they experienced in their military careers. And also, interestingly, sort of because the wars that we're fighting at the time were all in places where, this kind of stuff was incredibly forbidden and taboo, right? In Afghanistan in particular, and just sort of, what it meant to have this stuff in camp, even though it's always, it's always supposed to be something that you're supposed to be very careful with, but it was strongly forbidden, in countries where this kind of thing could really work against the purposes of the Army. So there were many interesting conversations with active military people about what this meant to them to read it and to think about it, and for somebody, to be writing, and for somebody to be writing about it, that and describing experiences in the Civil War that were similar to their own experiences. And there's been a lot of other interesting, responses to students reading it in classes, people who, again, who are love, just sort of, people who are just have a general interest in the period, have really responded to the book. I've talked to a lot of Civil War roundtables. It's been, I usually get invited to Civil War roundtables on sort of date night, right? When there's, when everybody's going to bring their spouse. And so I talk about the women. I usually get invited to that. But with this book, it was interesting. It was a very different kind of experience. It wasn't sort of shoehorned sort of into kind of a neat spot where, oh, she's going to be talking about women. This book was about, sort of talking more broadly about American culture. And so I've had some good responses there as well.
Yeah, I just think it's, especially with a book about sex and porn, just curious how people, respond to that. This is maybe a bit of a silly question given the fact that you wrote a book about this, but I think it's a fine place to start. A lot gets made about how soldiers turn to these previously forbidden pursuits once they get in the Army, like, cards, card playing, drinking, gambling, and sex, of course. Was it really as bad as all that? I mean, how pervasive was stuff like this?
So that's a really good question. It's hard to know. It's hard to make the argument that what the war did was sort of aggravate a problem, or sort of make it, make some of the, did the war create a problem among men, right? That they needed to consume this stuff. And certainly the argument about how pervasive it is a really, or the question is a really big one, because, to some extent, some people in positions, in command positions, complained a lot about it, and talked about this stuff being everywhere, and they're, they just couldn't burn it and collect it and destroy it fast enough. And so, if you follow their reporting, it sounds like this, that people are just sort of buried in this material. But as I argue in the book, some of this is a manifestation of a conflict that predated the war, in which was really, that really fell, the fissures fell along class lines, which is to say that certain sorts of, works of art or images or words, even in the hands of the elite, was considered to be art. But when it became sort of more generalized, generally accessible, and with the production of the access to cheap printing technologies, and the more rapid distribution of the mail and all that other stuff, once it became sort of more generally accessible to people and cheap, those same images became a point of concern among, that very same group of elite. They're the ones that started to using the terms, obscene or pornographic, because it was no longer something they were controlling. And so you can see some of that, spilling over and becoming more kind of hysterical in the ways in which people respond to it during the Civil War as well. On the other hand, as I also talk about in the book, all those technologies did make this stuff much more accessible. The stuff was more accessible. It was really cheap. And when you get a bunch of men concentrated in one place, in not one place, but, many one places, and you do have accelerated mail delivery and cheap mail delivery, then you really are creating what I describe in the book as sort of this perfect storm, porn storm, if you will, where the stuff can get to you faster, where, right, when one doesn't have to sort of, make their way to a newsstand or to a train station to buy the stuff. When the stuff is just, coming in the mail bags, then really you do have to sort of think about how the war is part of what brings this stuff to men in a new way and more plentifully.
What sort of punishments existed? What was there, like sort of a standard set of punishments, or did it vary by regiment? What were the consequences of being, caught with this?
So when folks take a look at the book, they'll find that, in fact, men are not being punished for reading naughty books or posting naughty pictures or using naughty postcards, playing cards. So what I found in the regimental order books and the court-martial records is that when somebody was a bad soldier, right, when they were otherwise not doing their jobs or not doing them well or falling down, right, in the line of duty, not performing their military duties, access to these materials or the reading of materials was called in as further evidence of their being a bad soldier. But for men who were recognized, right, among their comrades as being good soldiers, porn wasn't a problem.
Yeah, fascinating. It's all about, if you're doing your job, then good for you, and if you're not, then it's just one of perhaps a list of reasons why you might be deficient. It speaks to me, and obviously a lot of this story has to do with morality in America. One of the reasons you could be turned away from being a soldier in the physical exam is if you were a habitual drunk, because this was seen as sort of a moral failing, and it's an honor to be a soldier for the United States, and that there's maybe some kind of similar strands going on there between the drinking and the pornography and such. I mean, you wouldn't be turned away from being a soldier if they found some porn on you or something like that, I presume. I'm guessing it didn't really come up often or ever, but I wonder if there's some kind of interesting commonality there, probably.
Absolutely right, and it reminds me too of what we know about some, women who disguise themselves as men and fought throughout the war, and later, later when they were fighting for their pensions, and they, people called up some of their former comrades to speak on their behalves, the men with whom these women served often said, "Oh yeah, well we knew, we knew that that he was a she, but." Right, but what we were more impressed with is that she did her job and she was a soldier. So I think there's a lot of that running through these records that I looked at as well.
An obvious connection, of course, between sex and the Civil War. It'll be interesting to see how pornography relates or perhaps doesn't relate to this subject and Civil War medicine is STDs in the Civil War. Can you talk about what sort of relationship there was there and what that was like, or if there was one?
Yeah, so this is there. You sort of. I mean, I should start off by saying I did not study that at all in this book, nor is this book about prostitution, which is another question I get a lot as well. I really tried to narrow the focus of the book on just the sort of visual and reading materials that were being passed around among the men, because that's what this 1865 law that I talk about in the book really focused on, was the materials that were being passed around, not behaviors either that led to the transmittal of STDs or the larger questions about prostitution or even sexual violence, which in contemporary feminist literature, those you don't talk about pornography without talking about those that in particular sexual violence and that kind of stuff. But certainly the sort of some of the same people who are wringing their hands about are wringing their hands about things like prostitution and the transmittal of STDs are also writing and interested and concerned about what men are spending their money on payday. So the United States Christian Commission, for instance, some of those people on the ground are raising concerns about all of this kind of behavior, and are seeking to find ways to prevent men from spending their money on whether it's prostitution, whether prostitutes, or whether it's illicit materials, and all of that stuff are also they're raising those concerns, and they're also talking about the problem of STDs. And of course, as a lot of your viewers know, there were efforts during the Civil War. There were some of the first efforts to license prostitutes. So there was a recognition that there were sort of practical ways one could combat STDs by acknowledging the fact that men would that soldiers would patronize prostitutes. So there was some of the first efforts to license prostitutes to make sure that they would be safe, and there's a lot of those kinds of conversations are begun during the war as well.
Yeah, I would have to imagine there were a number of arguments made by either officers or perhaps folks in the U.S. Christian Commission or even the U.S. Sanitary Commission, some kind of slippery slope arguments as it relates between porn and STDs and things of that nature. I'm sure that would have come up at some point.
Yeah.
And yeah, just like I said, especially in Nashville, there was a campaign to officially license and declare prostitutes, disease-free and things of that nature. Yeah, somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 200,000 diagnosed cases of syphilis and gonorrhea, which were the only two that they were aware of back then that were diagnosed during the Civil War. Talking about sort of the ramifications of all of this, so you've alluded to it a few times. Talk a bit about the Comstock laws or laws and kind of what kind of comes of this.
Yeah, sure. So Anthony Comstock became kind of the missing link in the other parts of the story, for me, because I had always encountered Anthony Comstock, maybe like some of your viewers have, which is in his post-war context, right? Anthony Comstock becomes the Postmaster General, the first person to have the job, the person for whom the job was created. And Comstock, and in that position became, the policeman of the laws, both state level and federal law, named after him, which were, a law passed in at the federal and state levels, passed in 1872 and 1873, that prohibited the mailing of pornographic materials through the U.S. mail. So my contact with him has always been then, right? So I sort of knew him there, knew him when, right? But what I didn't know is that Comstock was actually a soldier during the Civil War, until I started to do this project, and then discovered that he actually, served in his brother's regiment, Connecticut Regiment. So the Comstock Law, the first law that I talk about in the book, however, is the sort of precursor to the 1873 measure, which is an 1865 law passed by U.S. Congress at the beginning of 1865, which when the war was still being fought, and that law, it was sort of was the foundation for what would become the Comstock Law. And that law was passed very much as a war measure. So the law, when congressmen were discussing the law, they, unlike us, didn't know if they were going to, if the war was going to swing for the Union. We know that now. But when congressmen started debating the measure, they really, some of them made a convincing case for how, if the United States Army doesn't get its act together, and that they could lose the war if they didn't sort of, if they didn't quickly act to meet the crisis of having lost their manhood, right? Like they're sort of forgetting what it's like to be men. They went off, they started reading all these materials, and so they thought, and sort of to rescue the war, the war effort, they needed to rescue the men who were fighting the war. So the 1865 law was passed, and this is before Comstock was on the scene. He was still in the Army at the time. And it really was a nothing burger, right? Nobody ever, nobody was ever, very few people were charged under it. And nothing really happened with that first 1865 law, until the post-war era, right? Until the federal measure was passed, and built on that. And under the Comstock Law, the federal measure, Comstock Law, many people were brought up on charges of either selling the stuff or mailing the stuff. And it became a much, much more ambitious effort to control the way people talked about sex, the way they shared, scientific knowledge about reproduction, about birth control. Eventually the Comstock Law, the federal measure, and all the states passed their own Comstock laws as well. And the way people talked about sex, the way they talked about, it became also the foundation for many anti-sodomy measures. So it also built on the Comstock laws, were laws that prohibited homosexuality. So this became the 1865 law passed during the Civil War became the foundation for a radical rethinking of the way Americans, responded to sort of sexual thought, sexual thinking, sexual speaking. And so it did have big consequences, even though, again, as I described it was this nothing burger at first. And then Comstock Law, Anthony Comstock was the sort of missing link, right? Because when he, became the administrator of these morality laws, they really had an incredibly tragic effect, because many people who were charged on the Comstock laws, people who provided birth control or abortion services, many of them committed suicide while they were waiting for prosecution. So this became, this had a chilling effect on Americans and the way they talked about this stuff. It spilled over into conversations about marriage and concern that, with the growing immorality that manifested itself in divorce. It became a really very big kind of, again, correction or kind of a hysteria about, about what had gone wrong. And so, so to my mind, right, this became a more and more sort of, there are parallel measures happening before the war in other countries. But after the war, this became a particularly American thing, right? The way the Comstock Law was passed without no public interest in it at all, right? There was no pushing by the public for this at all. It just sort of, it came kind of from, congressmen, it came from sort of the top down, and the way it sort of chilled the way Americans talked about sex and experienced it and all of that stuff became, sort of set the United States off in a very different direction than their European counterparts. So, so there is something unique about the way Americans responded to what they thought they saw during the war. And the way that response or that reaction manifests itself not only in the laws, but in the way Americans still today, I think, talk about and deal with matters of, of sexual nature.
Yeah, well, and you're headed towards, we've obviously touched on this at various points throughout here, but maybe provide a specific example or two of how the Civil War changed attitudes in relationship to sex or pornography and such, and specifically where we can see kind of traces of that still around today. A big part of what we do here at the museum is connecting the past to the present. And I think you're spot on. I think there are a lot of ways where we can kind of, if we squint, we can see some traces of that. So maybe provide an example or two.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, I mean, I would say the first thing is, the measure was supposed to be that the 1865 law was supposed to be aimed at controlling the sexual behavior of men, right? It was about, concern that these men had two, and people talked about them sort of as boys, right? That they were young, and that was interesting. That's interesting. Even that language is kind of interesting. Is like, we need to sort of protect these young men, boys from themselves. And the way we do that is we pass this law that makes it harder for them to get this stuff. And then, then they'll continue, that they won't get messed up, they won't get sort of broken. But the measure in the end, the Comstock law, the federal law, and the state measures really turn out to be much more effective at controlling women's sexuality. So Comstock laws never work to prohibit porn, right? Like Avenue Q song goes, right? That the internet is about porn, right? That's not the exact song, but that's the song that came out of that musical. Was, that really what, that none of these laws ever really controlled men's sexuality the way they really controlled women's sexuality. Is really, I think, a really good example of what we were just talking about. And of course, the Comstock laws are what what outlawed access to birth control and abortion, and right, and the last vestiges of that. Of those laws were sort of swept away by Roe versus Wade, and a decision that was made 100 years after the original Comstock law was passed. Federal Comstock law was passed. So yet, when I wrote this book, right, I think that whole sort of history has changed since I wrote this book. I think we're now sort of looking at another moment of overcorrection going on at the federal level that we know, statistically speaking, does not represent where people are think about this stuff and want the country to go. But that's where we have it. And again, that sets, the United States in many ways on a very different historical trajectory than many of the people we like to compare ourselves to. So somehow these kinds of, this post Civil War moment in which these laws, were passed and were supposed to be about, Comstock thought that there was this connection between sex, men, seeing pornographic and sexual images or words, and that it elicited violence in them. That he worried about the violence that it would that would be unleashed. So this was about sort of, he thought that it was about kind of the images of naked women that made men violent, when he was in the midst of a war and didn't see that maybe it was the violence, right? That what we're looking at is, men living through the worst sort of violence that any of them had seen, that any of them would ever see in their lifetime. And instead of sort of thinking about how we as a society are responsible for putting young men at that time, and now young men, women and men in violent situations, how that is something that we think a lot less about than we think about sort of, sex and we think about sexual images. It is an inheritance, I think, we have from that period. And we haven't been able to sort of untangle it. Or maybe we just don't have any interest in untangling. It's just the way that we will always see things.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, connecting it between then and now, and how, at various points, there's some, not necessarily history repeating itself, but there's certainly some rhyming going on, as it were. What do you think is next on this research front for the aspiring researchers out there, to kind of build on this work, or maybe take a turn down a slightly different avenue?
That's a great question, John. I have a list. Here's a couple things I'm thinking about for sure. It's not entirely clear how this happens. We know it happens, but until we dig down and look at the local political landscape in the post-war era, will we actually be able to sort of really, suss this out. But these measures that are passed in the states, in every state that passes an anti-pornography measure, they get these riders. These riders are added on to these local measures that are oftentimes sponsored by physicians. And those riders, or those sort of additions to these laws that are intended to prohibit pornographic materials, begin to prohibit also, certain kinds of, medical advice and medical practices, and also abortion services. So how those riders get added on is still very much, unexplored. We haven't, people haven't looked locally at all the local, shenanigans, political shenanigans that go on there, because these measures are supposed to be, about controlling access to porn, but how they become also controlling access to abortion and birth control is still largely unexplored. We can see the end effect of it, but I think there's something really interesting to be learned about how this kind of, what are the local concerns and what are the situations on the ground locally in which people, are able to manage to put these riders in place, is one, I think, really a really interesting question that still has not been fully explored.
Absolutely. So anyone out there who's thinking about a topic to dive into, look no farther. There's more to be done. Lastly, I just want to close. I always like asking authors this sort of question, especially now that the book. Once people write a book and it's out in the world, it in some ways takes on a life of its own. What is your hope for the book? When someone picks it up, what do you want them to take away from it?
So I guess my biggest hope is that that it will inspire people to think again about about a war that we kind of think we have all figured out, right? That that, and I get that's a big one, right? I guess that's what all of us who write a book about any period want, is they want us to sort of go back and say, okay, well, maybe this is not, maybe I thought I knew everything there was to know about the war, but I guess there's certainly let me answer the question another way as well. I guess one thing that people can do is look at this book and say, well, maybe Civil War soldiers weren't as different from us as we thought. Maybe we have a lot of there are similarities between us and them. But right, what I would encourage people to think about is in what ways have we sort of wedded ourselves to one outcome of this conversation, and how knowing some more about how we got to where we are, how we can see our way forward to different outcomes or other ways of seeing this. We're not sort of wedded to the Comstock laws that came out of the war, that in fact if we know more about where they came from, then maybe maybe we can agree 100 years later that or more than 100 years later now, that from the Comstock laws, that maybe that's not who we are, right? And maybe there are some crucial differences between where we are today and where we were then.
Lots to ponder there. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Judy. I really appreciate it. I know I had fun. I hope you had some fun as well, and I hope all of you out there enjoyed your time today. If you enjoyed our conversation, great way to support the museum and these videos is to like and share the videos, tell your friends about them, and all that sort of thing. And if you really enjoyed the conversation, you might consider picking up a copy of the book, Sex in the Civil War, available in our museum bookstore or in our online store. You can find a link to that in the description of the video. And if you want to take it even one step further beyond that, you can consider becoming a member of the museum, which you can also find in the comments or in the description. Well, thank you for being here with us today, Judy.
Thank you, John.
And we'll catch all of you all next time.